Woman! Whoa, man! Whoa, man!
So today I just want to talk about climate anxiety, and I think it's more important to talk about it now than it's ever been. And more so from my own experience as well, because I can only talk from my experience. I haven't really talked to that many people about it myself. And it's a funny feeling to get to kind of be anxious about the climate and climate change and the conversations around it, because there's kind of almost, for me anyway, this kind of like embarrassment I felt around being anxious about something that isn't necessarily affecting me right here, right now. It's kind of like this omnipresent feeling that's kind of around me, which I'm not physically affected by, but mentally it's frightening.
Oh God, I'm so startled.
And it doesn't affect me all the time. But when it does, it still kind of leaves me kind of with that feeling of like embarrassment and, you know, where's this even came from? And, you know, how do I kind of move on from this feeling? So I'm going to kind of just talk about all of that basically and just kind of unpack it from my perspective, because I've had some just funny moments with it and I can deal with it a lot better now, but it's still kind of there. But how I process it and how I deal with it's changed from when I kind of first started recognizing this climate anxiety creep in.
But you can't live in fear. Let's go.
So, it was during lockdown when I first kind of felt like the pressures of climate change, you know, just kind of hit me. And I think it might have did for a lot of people, because lockdown provided us this space to just kind of slow down, reflect, read up on things a little bit more that, you know, related to the climate and what was going on, and really like dig down into information that can be frightening, can be unsettling, can be quite jarring. And within that, I think the reason that it was unsettling, frightening, and jarring is, yeah, you know, what could happen is quite frightening. And it is something that, you know, I think a lot of it would frighten a lot of people. But that's kind of like worst case scenarios. But when things are written in a way that kind of makes it seem as though there is no way out, that like the worst case scenario is going to happen, you know, it just leaves you feeling as though that you're helpless. Hence this kind of like anxiety kind of starts to build and bubble up inside of you, because you just kind of think, well, I can't do anything about it. And that's also the kind of top layer of anxiety as well, is because if you feel like you can't do anything about it, you kind of just start to spin out. And I was starting to spin out a little bit. But also when you're reading these articles, you need to kind of remember that, you know, the ones that are well written and the ones that are frightening are presented in a way to kind of make you feel that way, to give you that feeling of something needs to be done. So I don't necessarily blame people for doing that, because it certainly lit a spark up my arse to kind of wrap my head around and just kind of think about how I can be just a little bit more eco-conscious and a bit more sustainable.
You're surrendering to the Earth Mother.
However, what that's kind of then led to was me feeling super anxious about the whole thought process of what climate anxiety meant, what climate change meant for me, the world, people, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, through lockdown, there was a time where I just kind of woke up one day and I was just kind of sitting downstairs in the kitchen, just kind of looking outwards of the window, just totally on autopilot, shut down. And I was just kind of like, I can't be bothered to move. I don't want to do anything. Like, what's the point? I can't change these outcomes. I personally am only one person, and just this thought of like not being in control just warranted me void. I had no intention to move that day, and I think I was just kind of sat there for a good 2 hours, what felt like more, just kind of lost in my own thoughts, just spinning out. And it was also during summer, where it was hot, and just the fact that it was really hot outside, like I didn't even want to go outside because I didn't want to be presented with the notion that like it is hot outside because of climate change. And whatever your thoughts are around it, whether or not you think that the summers have been and the summers that have gone are hot because of, you know, the climate changing, or if it's just general weather. You know what I mean? That's an argument in itself. And it's hard to kind of decipher because it's such a big conversation. But when you are feeling anxious, every little hint of like, is this climate change, just consumes you. Like every little thing that's happening, the rain's too heavy, it's too cold, it's too hot, flooding, and all of this, every weather-related issue just warrants you to just kind of think this is climate change, things are fucked. And it just sends you west. And, you know, I was just kind of like a zombie just walking around at times because I just had no drive to do anything. I just felt hopeless.
I stared into the abyss and it stared back at me.
And I remember even one night I couldn't get it off my head. I couldn't kind of get out this cycle of just feeling like a hopeless wreck. And I kind of woke up in the middle of the night and got out my journal because, I mean, I don't journal that much. I only do it when I need to kind of unpack my thoughts and feelings. But I was kind of writing things down, and I started, and I'm not even a religious person, but I was writing to God, or whatever God I thought there was at that time, to just be like, please, can we just kind of get through this? Please, can I stop feeling like a nervous wreck? Please, can I stop feeling hopeless? Because that's the kind of point I got to where I was just kind of pleading for a sign, or someone or something to just kind of pull me out of this pit of despair, to just be like, you'll be all right. Things are going to be fine. Don't worry about it.
Jesus, protect me.
But again, obviously in time, you kind of come to realize that you are your only hero in that moment. You are the only person who can pull you out of that pit of despair. No one and nothing is going to come along and help you. You've got to help yourself. And, you know, there are things you can kind of do to help you, to kind of pull you out of that, i.e. like reaching out, like turning to prayer, if that's something that kind of gives you comfort. But, you know, you can do things that are brought on by you generally putting yourself out there to kind of help pull yourself out of that pit of despair. Mine was talking to people, talking to my mum, talking to my sisters, and just generally kind of, you know, working through these emotions in a way where I was outwardly projecting what I was feeling internally, rather than letting myself just spin out and assume that the world's all going to shit and I might as well just do fuck all and, you know, not enjoy the rest of my life. But that's kind of how it, you know, made me feel. And just kind of the process from that and moving on from that, and kind of better understanding how I can move through the world where I'm going to be presented with these stories and arguments around climate change and what's going on. I had to kind of, you know, find new ways of dealing with that form of anxiety that I was feeling. So it's kind of when I start to turn to breathing exercises to kind of just help calm my internal feelings, to just kind of slow like myself down, my breathing down, my panic down, just kind of breathing through it and just kind of calming myself. That helped massively. Wim Hof, that dude kind of changed my life in a way where, like, I turn to those breathing methods whenever I kind of feel out of control, because it really does calm me down. And it's almost proof that you can overcome the thoughts in your head. Just this notion of slowing yourself down, slowing down your breathing, and just kind of grounding yourself just that little bit more, and realizing that, like, in that moment, whilst you are panicking, you are actually okay, you are fine. And that kind of helped bring me back down to earth somewhat, because while I was up here swimming in a flurry of shit thoughts, that just kind of brought me back down. And again, once lockdown kind of ended, I was able to kind of meet more friends and kind of talk on it, and talk on the aspects of climate change and how other people feel about it. And I think reaching out and talking to other people about it is a really good thing. And I know sometimes you think the more I talk about it, it's kind of almost feels counterintuitive that, like, if you're frightened or scared of something or a topic, that talking about it is going to make it better. It doesn't seem like that's going to work, but it does. Because the more you talk about it and the more you're around other people who have calmer approaches to the topic, or a better understanding of aspects around it, or certain conversation within that space, it really does help to just kind of ground you, to kind of think, right, okay, there are other people who have different thoughts about it. Not everyone's spiraling out of control, because I think with anxiety and with the things that do make you feel anxious, in your head, you kind of think, well, if I feel like this, other people must feel the same. And that's why you kind of get that sense of panic, wherein it kind of stops you from talking to other people about it, because in your head, you almost kind of feel as though that your anxiety might rub off on them, and you might both become just this anxious mess of people trying to talk about a conversation, and you'll both just spin out. And it's not the case. That's anxiety talking, but it does help to talk to other people. And, you know, this kind of notion of feeling ashamed about being anxious around this notion of climate change, I think that comes from a few places. For me, I think it's kind of that almost shameful notion of, and I think from a masculinity perspective, that shameful notion of feeling anxious about something you can't see or feel, or being anxious about something that hasn't physically affected you yet. And that's not a bad thing. That's quite an empathetic thing. That's like a beautiful thought and feeling to have, that like you are worried about the impacts that aren't necessarily affecting you, but the impacts that, one, may affect you in the long term, and two, impacts that are affecting people in third world countries. But again, they're not affecting you, they're affecting other people. But that's quite an empathetic response to kind of thinking long term and what could happen and what also is happening to other people. And also just this kind of like embarrassment of just talking to people and telling people that like you are anxious about the climate. You know, it's not an embarrassing thing to admit or to even talk to people about. You know, I think it's quite bold and brave to be able to kind of talk about that, because there's nothing wrong with feeling fear. Because with fear also comes a realization of, I am only scared because I'm aware that things need to change. And within that change, I internally have to change who I am and my thoughts and the life that I'm living in order to kind of become a little bit more eco-conscious, a bit more sustainable. And yes, change is frightening. And yes, the kind of conversation around climate change can be frightening. But in regard to that feeling of kind of what does that mean for me in regard to my life and what I have to change, that's a period at which you can kind of reflect on and think about is, well, that's a moment for me to grow. That's a moment for me to kind of become a better person, somebody else who kind of goes through life and is more conscious of the effects that he has on the bigger picture. And yes, you might be one person. And I know it's hard to kind of wrap your head around the fact that what can me as one person do to ultimately create change? But even just having conversations, taking small steps to be more conscious, having conversations like this, and, you know, like I'm having to the camera at the minute, but just talking to yourself about it, you know, that change has ripple effects on the people around you. And, you know, over time, those ripple effects, you'll be surprised by how far they spread. And even now, even people have conversations on the news about it. There's this constant cycle of change that's now occurring. And, you know, you kind of have to take solace in the little wins and also the big wins when they come. But good things don't happen overnight. Good things take time. But accept the small wins, the small conversations, you know, enjoy the moments where you don't feel anxious. Enjoy the moments where you realize that you are helping and you are making a difference, because they do help you just form a better picture of yourself and the wider discussion around it. And you kind of start to see the positive changes more than, you know, seeing the negative changes and allowing them to consume you. The more you kind of realize that there are small wins happening every day, the better your outlook and the positivity that you feel within you becomes.
I have exorcised the demons. This house is clear.
So anyway, I hope that helps. I just thought it was really important to just talk about this notion of climate anxiety and why you shouldn't feel embarrassed around, you know, feeling anxious, because I think more and more people will begin to feel those anxious effects, because it is a big conversation and quite an existential conversation, to be fair. Christ. I mean, you know, it's enough to spin anybody out, but there are a lot of positives happening. There are loads of small changes occurring that will become big changes. And there are big changes happening. You just don't see them in the news as often because people tend to focus on the negatives more than the positives. But go looking for the positives. Look for the people who are creating change, because that'll help you realize that there is good happening, and you know it's not all shit and nightmarish scenarios. You know, there's good shit happening. So yeah, I hope that helps.